Welcome to Pacific Unitarian Universalist Church. It is almost St. Patrick's Day, which is the theme for our service today. I'm going to start us out with a few announcements. The first announcement being it's pledge time. And that is, we tend to be a very not heavy-handed church about money, but this is that 3 to 4 week period of time where we push people to make a pledge. And I encourage those who are watching at home to just think about church. It doesn't really cost us much less to not have people here than it does. So if you're someone who's been served, not necessarily your first week or once or twice, but if you're regularly tuning into our services, please, there's a pledge button on the homepage of the website, and there's a lot of other ways to give. If you would make a pledge, which is not a gift at the moment, but a promise to give. We're going to hear more about that from Darcy later on. A few announcements. The saddest announcement of the last week is that Godfrey Purnell, nearly a founding member of our church, passed away on Monday morning. That's big news for us. He is the, I don't want to get too choked up, but he's sort of one of the Mount Rushmore of parishioners. Died pretty peacefully on Monday. We're going to have a service for him right at this, in the same way you're watching it now, at noon next Sunday. So right after church, we're going to take a little break, and then we're going to go back. His sons are going to be here, and we're going to have a memorial service for him. Next year, on his birthday, we're going to have a big party for him, a celebration of life. But this coming Sunday at 12, not next week, almost this time, we'll have a service for Godfrey. Our pledges were about 2/3 of the way to the pledge campaign, which is good. The hardest part comes with the digging now. We've started a new Saturday racism class, which has been very sort of, people have had a chance to share, and I think it's been very, sort of heartening as much as educational, which is good. We've also started a drumming circle that starts at 9 o'clock. If you want to come on, and you can come up and sit outside and drum with Kelly on the gazebo, or you can check in on Zoom. There were 5 or 6 people on there today from Florida and Boston and who knows where. This week, the seniors meet at 2 on the patio. You can come forward for that. And that's Tuesday at 2. Everyone's essentially, if you're a senior, identify that way, you're welcome to come to that. And then we're having a seekers meeting on Wednesday at 10. Following that seekers meeting, if anybody wants to go for a hike or a walk around on the Strand, we sort of do a monthly hike. I kind of move it around just to get people out. We're going to start at my house, which is 2030 Ardmore in Hermosa. You can call me if you want more details, but that's at 1 o'clock on Wednesday. So we're going to take a walk down on the Strand and on the Greenbelt for a couple miles. Okay, we're going to hear from Darcy for our chalice words, and I'm going to light our chalice.
Boy, it's really hard not to sing out when you hear Severin playing Lean On Me.
Yeah.
Okay, for this community, we illuminate chalice, symbol of our free faith, as UUs do today throughout the world. Through this simple act, we unite also with that larger community, adding the light of our small flame to the great struggle for justice, love, and peace on the earth.
Our opening words today are very simple. Today is a time to think about St. Patrick. St. Patrick's Day in 1957 was the first meeting that was the meeting that eventually became this church. So it's sort of meaningful for us on a couple different levels. Historically, we've had green beer here on this day. So we share an anniversary with St. Patrick, which is a pretty fun saint to have as your patron saint for your startup. It will soon be his day after all. And we're going to step back into the 4th century and look at St. Patrick for the much more of a sort of a hot mess of globalization than you might think. Maybe all the beer we drink has made us forgetful that his story is a little bit more complex and globalized than you might think. He was a mix of humble and faithful Christian. He was a slave boy. He was a slick, tactical, political worker. He was an opportunist. He is the axis where the pagan and the Christian world met in Ireland, and his story awaits us, but not before we turn to a hymn. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. Some say Jesus walked on water. Some say Noah built an ark. Some say Buddha had a great tree. Some say the tablets were God's law. But it's up to us. It's up to us. As we search for truth and meaning, inherent worth and dignity, finding justice and compassion is our responsibility. It's up to us. It's up to us. It's up to us to make it happen. It's up to us to work for peace. You and I, we have the power. There's so much we can achieve, but it's up to us. It's up to us. Some say prayer will make it better. Some say miracles are real. We take action as required if we want to turn the wheel. And we build this house of sharing, build this home for hold our care. Together we move mountains when each friend and member share. So it's up to us. It's up to us. It's up to us to make it happen. It's up to us to work for peace. You and I, we have the power. There's so much we can achieve, but it's up to us. It's up to us. It's up to us. It's up to us.
Good morning, everyone. Have you ever heard the word unchurched? I never had until somebody acquainted me with it. I was unchurched for all of my adult life. My mother and my brother and I left the Catholic Church not too long after my father died at a very young age. We sort of felt done. In defense of the Catholic Church of my youth, at that time, every single thing that they did was in Latin. The whole service was in Latin. So no wonder it felt pretty meaningless for us all. And they had no music at my particular church. And I mean, there was no choir, no piano, no organ, no music. I'm a singer, I'm musical. I might have hung around a little bit if they'd had something. So Reverend John Morehouse was the minister the first time I came to visit here. Maybe it's probably just about 9 years ago almost. And he said to me that most people come to a church for the first time because they've had something difficult or upsetting in their life. You know, a death, a divorce, loss of a job, a serious illness, or some not getting along with the family at all. And I was no exception to that. I was going through a difficult time in my life when I came. And also, those of us who are newbies at a church, you know, you're looking, probably wondering for something spiritual, but you don't know exactly what that spiritual thing is. As for me, I've always been a really social person, and I'm a joiner and a people person. That's always kind of a I think that's sort of a cornball term sometimes, but that's it. I'm a people person. However, don't forget, I was unchurched. I was also unchurched all my life. So after the service, and he gave a wonderful sermon about courage that really grabbed me. But afterwards, I looked out on the patio and hear all these people talking and smiling and eating lunch and laughing and being really friendly. You know what? I scurried home. I felt really reluctant to join into that. And it wasn't that I was suspicious that it was, something cult-like or anything. I just felt reluctance and a shyness that I don't usually feel. So I scurried home. And it took a few weeks before I actually put my toe in the water and started going out onto the patio afterwards and getting to know people. So what I'm getting to here, I want you to picture capital letters. I'm getting to the word fellowship in capital letters. Fellowship, something that I hadn't experienced because I was, unchurched all my life. People at this church genuinely care about each other, and they really care about helping each other. We also have a lot of programs to help people who are outside of our circle, outside of this church. But if you think about it, what is more important in life than caring about each other and helping each other? What is more important on this earth than that? So I'll end with telling you that my mom died a year ago, just as the pandemic was starting, just about a week before everything shut down. And when I got a call from the nurse who said, "Come right now," I knew I have a close friend in Pasadena. It was a weekday and it was at traffic time. I have a really close friend in Pasadena and a really close friend in Northridge. And I knew there was no way possible that they could get here. It wasn't even worth contacting. They'd never get here. So I sent a little group text to 4 or 5 PUC people, including Reverend Steve. And I think it was like a half a minute before I got a response text from Leanne and Gary saying we're on our way. And then when I got there to my mom's bedside, she had actually died just like minutes before I got there. But that was okay because, I'd been at her bedside a lot. I'd given her a lot of loving goodbyes already. But I had Leanne and Gary there that held me and let me cry. And minutes after that, Reverend Steve showed up too. And also a couple of weeks before that, a couple of traumatic emergency room kind of things going on. And a couple other people from our church showed up. And Janet Steinberg, who was amazingly helpful. She knows hospitals. I didn't even know her that well. So, and I don't have any family that's still in California. They've all moved to other places. But you know what? I have family here. So I am never alone here, and you are never alone.
Thank you, Darcy. That was moving, and I remember being with you and your mom those days. So give so that this tribe can continue and grow and thrive. We've spent a fair bit of money trying to do the virtual thing, and we're working on the details of how to do that and back together. So that was touching. But, the practical reality is it takes money to run our show. And our show, meaning this tribe. I'm going to invite Leanne to come forward and light our Joys and Concerns candle, which I think this week is summarized mostly by the passing of Godfrey. Let's take a minute to bless him on his journey. 13 days from 99 years old. It's pretty good. We got folks who are grieving lost husbands from Christmas, and we've got people who've got kids in tough spots in the Midwest, and people who are grieving aunts at home who are in drumming circles today, and an endless counts of emotional boo-boos and big things, lost dogs, and So, Leanne's going to come forward and she's going to share a prayer with us. I do want to introduce that prayer a little bit with just a few words. Yeah, that's going to follow the children's moment, which is on how to catch a leprechaun. And I invite all those who are young at heart to come down forward and watch this video, a little rhyming little tale about how to catch a leprechaun. And leprechauns are part of the impish coyote characters of the world, the sort of little devilish things that sneak around the corners. And I want you to think about it in that great Irish mythic tradition. So, how to catch a leprechaun.
How to Catch a Leprechaun. Written by Adam Wallace. Illustrated by Andy Elkerton. The night is dark. The streets are quiet. St. Patrick's Day is near. I tap my hammer so you'll know the leprechaun is here. I'll pull out all your laces, put glitter in your hair, and when you walk around, you'll see my gold coins everywhere. You'll never catch me in your trap, but yes, I'll make a scene. I'll turn the whole place upside down. Your toilet will be green. House number 1, I'm going in. Really? That's your trap? I'm in and out without a doubt. That one was a snap. And now I think it's getting worse. A shoebox on a stick? I'll dance a jig and still escape. We leprechauns are quick. Another house. I fixed your shoes. They really were quite smelly. I'll eat the nuts you left as bait and leave with a full belly. Now you're talking. Look at this. It's dandelion tea. But I'm too speedy for your trap. This tea is mine for free. I know you want my pot of gold. That iron cage was clever. But I've been alive for 200 years. You won't catch me, ever. Ha 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 ha. Now you're getting fancy. But I'll escape with twinkle toes. It's a fancy-pantsy dancy. It seems to me an engineer has helped with this design. Too bad this little leprechaun is going to be just fine. Your entire house is one big trap, from ceiling to the floor. Nice try indeed, but soon enough, I'll stroll right out the door. The leprechaun be gone 3000 gave me quite a scare, but without a 4-leaf clover, I won't be caught in there. You'll never catch this leprechaun. Impossible, that's a fact. Unless one day a brilliant child designs the perfect trap. But who will that child be? Better luck next year. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe. Want to check out the last story we read?
Our prayer this morning is a meditation on hope and love in a time of struggle by Alice Anecha Nazman. In a world filled with brokenness and sorrow, it would be easy to lose ourselves in never-ending grief, to be choked by our outrage, to be paralyzed by the enormity of suffering, to feel our hearts squeezed tight with hopelessness. Instead, this morning, let us simply breathe together as we hold our hearts open. Breathing in as our hearts fill with compassion, breathing out as we pray for healing in our world and in our lives. Breathing in, opening ourselves to the transforming power of love. Breathing out as we pray for peace in our world and in our lives. Breathing in we hold open our hearts. Breathing out, we pray for justice in our world and our lives. May we know our strength. May we be filled with courage. May our love flow from us into this world. May we know our strength. May we be filled with courage. May our love flow from us into this world. Amen. Blessed be. May it ever be so. We will now have a moment of silence followed by music by Severin.
I'd like to begin today's sermon with a reading or a couple little paragraphs from what was the Theodosian Codex. So during the years prior to the Roman Empire coming into Europe, there was quite a bit of the sort of ancient religious world was a pretty tolerant place for different religion. There were occasional persecutions and bursts of this or that sect, but more than that, there was kind of a tolerance. During the years 390 to 395 in particular, all that changed when the Roman Empire fully adopted Christianity and the emperors wrote some codexes. And I just want to provide St. Patrick's time with a little bit of context. Here's a couple paragraphs from those codexes. No one shall consult a soothsayer, astrologer, or diviner. The perverse pronouncements of augurs and seers must fall silent. The universal curiosity about divination must be silent forever. Whoever refuses obedience to the command shall suffer the penalty of death and be laid low by the avenging sword. Sounds a lot like Jesus, doesn't it? Whatever privileges have been allowed under the ancient laws to priests, ministers, prefects, hierophants of the pagan cults, however they have been known by other names, are to be entirely abolished. Nor should pride themselves on being protected by any privilege, since their profession is now condemned by law. That is the context upon which St. Patrick's is born. So I'm probably a little generous to him in this thing, but St. Patrick was a fairly soft version of what Christianity entered Ireland with. And I'm going to tell you his story as best as history allows. So with all the confidence I should warrant, I'm going to tell you the story of the man that people will raise a glass to this week. It's probably more complex than you might know. It takes place in the early 5th century, mostly not exclusively in Ireland itself, which was at the edge of the known world at that time, and up to that time had nothing but an oral history to it. Of course, there's always a little myth in the water of Ireland, right? So it's always hard to determine truth from tall tales. It's sort of back in history as well. So the confusion begins as to exactly where the pre-saintly young Patrick was born. The strongest argument is that he was born in 387 in Scotland. We know that he was born to Christian, essentially sort of parents who were working and living in Britain as civil servants of the empire. His parents were in essence nothing more than sort of highbrow missionaries who themselves had multiple properties and they had their own slaves. They were bringing the Roman Empire to the edge of civilization in Britain at the time. And St. Patrick's story, as it turns out, is much more multicultural than we would have expected. So coming from me, who was born of my dad's, we're Protestant Irish. My dad's right from Ireland, an Orangeman, as was the talk in the day. In the language of a generation or two ago, there was a certain snickering pride, that when we discovered that St. Patrick was of British origins, tee-hee-hee. But I would never stoop to such a parochial thing. Outside of a bit of privilege, there's nothing about Patrick as he was known. His original birth name was, and I'm probably going to mispronounce it, Maewon Succat. Maewon Succat became St. Patrick. That feels pretty unique. And when he was 16 years old, his life of sort of privilege and entitlement kind of changed. He was kidnapped by marauders on a raid into his village in Britain. And he was shortly thereafter sold into slavery into what is now we think of as Northern Ireland. I love looking back from the safety of the future. I love it because I know something that he does not. I know that this recently enslaved foreign teen has no idea that he'll become probably the most famous Irishman of all time. He was at this point just recently enslaved, brought to a new country, just a scared teenager in a rough spot. He doesn't know if he'll survive. He doesn't know if he'll ever get home to see his parents again. He was enslaved and then purchased to be a shepherd for an Irish chieftain named Milchu in Dalriada. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing those two. Long before he was the patron saint of Ireland, Maewon endured 6 years of lonely nights on Antrim's long, raw and open fields. And although it never gets brutally cold in Ireland, it does get raw almost all year round. It's sort of cool. It was a tough and lonely experience for St. Patrick, who really used this time. It drew him closer and closer to God. Although nobody should ever feel responsible for being kidnapped, shortly before he was taken into captivity, St. Patrick, who wasn't St. Patrick yet, talked about a fault that he had, a subject during his years that he would occasionally repeat. This fault drove and haunted him, and he never mentioned clearly what it was. Let's take a modern moment to provide a good dose of that modern self-esteem building reassurance that we want to give kids these days and whisper in his ear. I want to put my arm around St. Patrick and I want to say, take heart, kid. There are big things headed your way you can't see. You're gonna get past this mysterious fault that shames you, and you're going to make a big difference. I just want to tell him that at this point because he won't know that, and he never would know how mythically important he would become. History forbids these kind of, generous acts of historical stuff. Some of the painters never get to know that they're appreciated and their works sell for millions of dollars and they'd be hung, all over the place. And St. Patrick was one of those. How about trying on a new name, Maywan? I might want to say, how about Patrick? How does that sound? And let's put a saint in front of it. I like the ring of that, I would want to tell him. You're gonna, when you're long, long, long gone, you're going to be the source of a lot of fun. You won't see that. That's a long time away. And I'm sorry you won't see that, but I'm sure he could have used that kind of reassurance at that time, right? His only friend at this time was God. He would write later in it, as he grew older, in sort of a historical, his own autobiography called The Confession, that the Lord had mercy on his youth and his ignorance and afforded him the opportunity to be forgiven of his sins and converted to Christianity. It's a little unclear to me how his parents were missionaries, but he wasn't a convert. I don't know. Maybe that's where the fault comes in. He took what would be a terrible experience to anyone, being enslaved and left isolated on raw hills of Ireland. A lot of people would have let that turn to anger, but Maywan never did. He lived mostly in these isolated hills. He learned Irish as a second language. And during his 6 year of capture, he had this dream that he should get ready for a courageous journey back to the homeland. Not too much later, he heard a voice that urged him to take off for a distant port where he would find a ship that would take him away. As the story goes, in one fateful moment, he takes off from his owner and travels 200 miles on foot over the rough countryside to the coast where his vision had led him. He found a ship preparing to depart in a port called Wicklow, and after initial failure to talk himself on board of this ship in his desperate state, he goes back home, he prays some more, he goes back to the sailors, and they let him on board. Luck of the British, you know. They left, and as the history gets a little fuzzy, they report they're sailing. This is, again, 5th century, so the ships weren't very good. They didn't probably go too far out to sea. But their ship, they sort of run ashore in what turns out to be France, and they're lost in the European wilderness, the whole group of this ship, for 28 days. They're weary, they're faint from hunger, the whole shipmates. And Patrick steps forward as the story goes, and he beseeches his shipmates to have faith in God. And then shortly after that, they run into a herd of wild boar, and they are able to kill a couple of them. And this act of faith that leads to this place, they get some trust in St. Patrick. He essentially saves them. Again, this period is fuzzy, of course. We're getting it, 21-year-old, 22-year-old Patrick from a long way back. But during his time in France, he learns about French monasticism. He stayed there before he was united back with his family. It was pleasingly ironic that this British kid, born to parents who were ambassadors of the Roman Empire, who seemed to have given birth to him in Scotland, ended up spending most of his early adult years in France, where before he became the patron saint of Ireland. How's that for globalization? Not long after escaping from Ireland, Maywan, or Patrick, ironically began to have visions that called him back to Ireland. One of these visions Patrick accounts for is seeing some famous missionary preceding him and carrying back letters that said, "The voice of the Irish." In the same dream, he reports hearing an appeal to you to come walk among us was another part of this dream. Grateful for having escaped Ireland, Patrick devoted himself to learning and training for God. Most of his time between his enslaved teen years, he gets out of Ireland somewhere around 21 or 22, and he studies for about 12 years with a famous priest named Saint Germain, who ran a famous monastery at Auxerre. Although by any standard, Patrick was pretty well trained, he spent his whole life feeling like he wasn't established enough, he wasn't learned enough, right? He didn't have that early privilege taken away from him by his slave years. And when he writes, though, scholar D.A. Binchley says that the moral and spiritual greatness of the man shines through every stumbling sentence of his rustic Latin. And he was sort of more effective that way. He wasn't necessarily a scholar, but he sort of bared his soul. He had an earnestness that was attractive to people. And in the end, he was prompted by this priest to he went to Rome, and went to Rome during a time called the Pelagian controversy, which for us Unitarian Universalists, you may not know this, but it was particularly interesting. It was a controversy where people were judged, where the question about whether you'd be judged for what you did or what you said and how much faith you had, a classic sort of tension within Christianity. Are you more about what you claim to believe, or are you more about the walk you talk? Was active. And the Pelagian controversy sort of judged Jesus, and it was just an interesting time. So when think about being on the theological end of any debate, we're usually on the losing end, and often that gets us killed. Anyway, back to our story of Patrick. He returns from Rome and he gets more training, and then in the year 432, sort of a middle-aged man, Patrick was about 45. He's appointed the second bishop to Ireland by Saint Germain. He wasn't yet Patrick even, but he goes back to Ireland and he lands in the same port that he escaped from in Wicklow. You can imagine the sort of stress and like reminiscence and just, I don't know, post-traumatic stress is what comes to mind. And he wasn't even greeted there warmly. He was sort of pushed aside, and they needed to enter another port before they could land, right? There was a lot of border, sort of defense of shipping ports at that time. So he goes a little bit further north. He enters the country, and you want to whisper into his ear again, because he's back sort of in hostile territory, right? I want to go, Patrick, come here. Take heart. I just want you to know this will eventually work. There's going to be some trying times here. You're going to be threatened with your death. You're a little more than the slave boy that was here a while back. You will leave behind more than 300 churches and be converted for converting over 100,000 Irish. So fret not, this will work. Oh yeah, and then I want to tell them you'll be largely forgotten for a long while, and then after a couple centuries, you will become the official patron saint of the Irish with your own feast day, and then about 1,000 years later, hundreds and then thousands, and by the year 2000, millions and millions of people will dress in green and get drunk and fight like, well, rowdy pagans in your name. Congratulations, I think. Patrick was successful not only because he was committed to his cause and either lucky because he wasn't killed a few times or he was fated, who knows, right? Maewán became Patrick because at least as much as anything, he understood and accepted the Irish for where they were. The basic point is that he and his disciples preached and converted thousands pretty quickly. They, for better or worse, and I'm not here to judge whether building churches in a pagan country is good or bad. We'll leave that for another day. In some cases, kings and their families and entire kingdoms converted when hearing Patrick speak. Not surprisingly, though, in attempting to convert some, he made some enemies, like the Celtic Druids, who were still there, and imprisoned him a few times, and obviously each time he escaped. See, part of what Patrick got in trouble was that when he strolled back into Ireland, not only with a new theology, he strolled back seeming to have to also change the power dynamics of the time. It were tribal chieftains that were the leaders there. He set up monasteries, and he essentially aligned and sort of supported the disenfranchised people that were not part of the establishment at that time. He roamed around without protection and got jailed and nearly killed. It was hostile times for everyone. Patrick offered those outside the power dynamics a certain kind of safety in the monasteries that they built. His 40 years went a lot like that. There were great successes and failures. There were earnest conversions, and there were offensive assumptions. It was Patrick who, from the very beginning, gave a particularly Irish stamp to the way he evangelized his chosen people. Rather than eradicating the native beliefs as superstitious, he incorporated them. For instance, because the Irish honored their gods with fire, Patrick used bonfires to celebrate Easter and superimposed a sun. If you think of the Irish symbol, right, it's got that the Irish cross has a big circle in it. The Irish honored that sun, and they put that right in the Christian cross, a classic act of syncretism. It was the legacy of Patrick that we see in that cross. The untold blessing of Patrick was the legacy of monasticism that he created, and the scribes that documented the history that had been burned and destroyed in so many other places. Essentially, there's a book called The Irish Saved History, and that's somewhat true because the monastics recorded history that did not get destroyed. He cultivated a pattern of going into different cities and handing people a "Kiss Me, I'm Irish" button. No, that's not true. I'm just kidding. He just seen if you're paying attention. He basically went into these towns and he focused on converting the women largely and the community leaders, and he built these monasteries. And he was accused at least a few times of inappropriately accepting gifts, particularly from wealthy women. He had a lot of success ministering to that group of people who were outside the male power structure. In particular, the wives of chiefs and such, he had sort of a soft touch for. There's no hanky-panky presumed here. At least there's no thought of that. He was a deeply faithful person. Some of Patrick's press clippings read that people would cry out from all sides that they wanted to become Christians. When they would move to the nearest water, he would baptize them. Of course, we have only the history of the winners, right? We have that mythic history. He raised up a population of native clergy and organized the Irish church into different territories. I mean, he was an amazing organizer, it seems. Patrick raised the standard of scholarship from nothing to something, and he pulled Ireland out of an oral tradition, which is not a bad or a good thing. He had just accomplished all of those things. He may have been the victim of chains of imprisonment. He was also seemingly comfortable throwing his weight around. As his fame grew, he came in to challenge kings. He was not opposed to some ego. And it seemed part of Patrick's tactics were to convert women and created nuns in Ireland. And those nuns came to famously work with the slaves and the poor in providing them security and a counterculture option for them. He obviously accomplished a lot. After all, we're talking about him 1,500 years after his time. History tells us that when you work for the victors, particularly at the edge of recorded history, particularly in a mythically charged place like Ireland, there will be stories. There were stories of him raising people from the dead, and not unlike Moses, he turned his walking stick into a living tree at one point in time, probably a bit of the crack from the Ireland, as they say, when they're just telling stories. There was a time in which mythically, I presume, he was punched at by a local king, but he froze his arm in place until the king could be won over to Christianity. The actual story about Patrick, about the snakes, is that Patrick chases them into the sea after he was attacked on a 40-day fasting trip on the side of a hill. This is unquestionably myth because there are no snakes in Ireland. Snakes are, of course, symbolic of pagans. But that 40 days is, of course, mimics Jesus' time in the wilderness and Moses' time in the desert. As for explaining the God's confusing three parts of the Trinity with the shamrock, it seems that this actually was a tool used already by the Irish in many cases. The shamrock was a symbol of the triple goddess of ancient Ireland, Bridget, Eru, and the Morrigan. However, it traces even back further to the Indus Valley, where the Celts had come from. Part of what makes Patrick's story so interesting is that he was right in the middle of an encounters with Picts and Celts. So you sort of, I was reading this, it was just sort of amazing to drop back into time to tribal existences that no longer are true. However, if St. Patrick is relatively old, 1,600 years or so to be exact from his birth, the celebration of St. Patrick's Day is relatively new. It's actually an American export back to Ireland, if you want to know the truth. Again, more globalization. See, St. Patrick's Day emerged as a cultural response to American Irish immigrants feeling slighted and oppressed in their new land, which they certainly were. And the emergence of St. Patrick's Day and its parades became a source of pride to these people, poor immigrants who'd been feeling the backlash of the establishment, generally the British, Protestant communities, and who were afraid of losing control. 1737 was the first Patrick's Day parade, and that was celebrated in Boston. There were parades organized by Irish soldiers who fought alongside the British during the US Revolutionary War. After the Revolutionary War, these celebrations came to arrive in Philadelphia and also Chicago. And from the 1800s on, wearing green on St. Patrick's Day emerged as a tradition. Since 1962, if you've ever been in Chicago, they generally or frequently make some of the river there green, right? And there's a massive parade down Fifth Avenue in New York City. Another reason St. Patrick's Day has become such a popular holiday is because it was allowed to be a break in the Lenten cycle of fasting. So this feast day broke up the sort of somber time of Catholics during this time. And if you're interested in marketing anything, it's a very good marketing tool to take a time of silence and deprivation and austerity and give people an opportunity to indulge. That is a fast track to becoming a popular saint and having your feast day memorized. So you might think of this. St. Patrick's Day would have the label Made in America, New York and Boston in particular. And when you think of the shirt that anyone most likely puts on, it's probably made somewhere in Southeast Asia or perhaps in China. Until 1970, St. Patrick's Day in Ireland was a minor religious holiday. Kind of odd, isn't it? As many Saints' Day are, it was a pretty uneventful feast when families would gather to celebrate in a big meal. But the transition has become one that we all claim. Probably a healthy act for the world. So slancia, as they say in Italy, health and cheers to you on St. Patrick's Day. Now I want to invite Darcy up to lead us in our offertory humor with an encouragement to give generously for the life and work of our church.
O'Hara arrived in Boston from rural Ireland just before the turn of the century. He had never been to such a big city, and strolling around, he found himself on a street corner waiting to cross. There was a cop directing traffic. After a group of cars had passed, the police officer shouted, "Okay, now pedestrians." And after a group of people crossed the street, the cop then waved on the horses and the carriages to pass. This actually happened several times, and O'Hara was still standing on the sidewalk. After the cop had shouted, "Pedestrians," for the third time, O'Hara couldn't take it anymore, and he approached him and he said, "Is it not about time ye let some of us Episcopalians or even some Catholics cross?" So give as if you were bribing a cop.
Oh, Danny boy, the pipes are calling. From glen to glen and down the mountainside. The summer's gone and all the flowers are falling. 'Tis you must go and I must bide. But come ye back when summer's in the meadow, or when the valleys hushed and white with snow. 'Tis I'll be here in sunshine or in shadow. Oh, Daddy boy, I love soul. When winters come and all the flowers are dying, and I am dead, as dead I well may be, you'll come and find the place where I am lying, and kneel and say an Ave there for me. But I shall hear, though soft, your tread above me, and all my grief shall warmer, sweeter be. And you will bend and tell me that you love me, and I shall sleep in peace until you come to me.
Amazing. Never sung better. I want to thank Gary for writing that song. The first hymn we heard, It's Up to Us, is one of his own creations, and just a great kind of earnest Unitarian hymn, isn't it, right? We also have the anniversary dinner on Saturday. Most of you are signed up. We're sort of closed that at this point, but we're going to have 60, 65 people on it. So a great thanks to Kelly Kinsman and to Leanne. Kelly particularly just beating the drums to get people out there. We're going to have Mexican food delivered to people's homes. We're going to have Shelton Johnson, who is a National Park Ranger, talk about integrating the parks in an interview I'm going to do with him. So that's the close of the pledge drive Saturday night at the anniversary dinner. It's sort of officially. So please get your pledges in. We don't want to talk about it any more than we have to. And then we'll be back Sunday, and we're going to have a lot of different people, myself and the President Susan Gray. Next week's service is going to be a mix and a melody of a lot of different things. So get your pledges in, and thank you for coming. Darcy, come start us off with our closing words.
It's up to us. This church is dedicated to the proposition that behind all of our differences, beneath all our diversity, there is a unity that makes us one and binds us forever together, in spite of time and death and the space between the stars. We pause in silent witness to that unity.
May the blessing of love be upon you. May love's peace abide with you. May love's presence illuminate your hearts now and forevermore. So be it. Amen. Shalom. Salam. Namaste. And blessed be. And as the Quakers say, and we should follow, and now our service truly begins. Go in peace. Be peace.
Qui demeure toujours. Ici-bas, les lèvres effleurent sans rien laisser de leur valeur. baiser qui demeura toujours. Ici-bas, tous les hommes pleurent leurs amitiés ou leurs amours. Je rêve à couple qui demeure à couple qui demeure. Qui demeure toujours.